Oftentimes they try and pilot these solutions before they're actually implemented, and if there isn't sufficient onboarding or uptake by the public, invariably an event comes along that creates fear and panic among the public to a very significant degree, and they begin clamoring for solutions to this problem that's causing the fear and panic. And the solution is often something that's been tested or pitched years prior.
Whitney Webb has warned that governments and global organizations are increasingly advocating for digital IDs as the next standard in identification. These IDs will rely heavily on biometric data, things like your fingerprints, facial features, and even iris scans, to create a unique, secure digital identity linked directly to your physical ID. The plan is to gather all this data and tie it to a digital ID that represents you across both physical and digital spaces. This future might sound intimidating to some, but according to Whitney Webb, it's a very real direction many elite organizations are working toward, including influential players like BlackRock. The World Economic Forum (WEF) has published numerous articles that align with Webb's message, highlighting that digital ID is not a standalone project but is directly tied to central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and a broader AI-driven digital finance system. Documents from both the UN and the Bank for International Settlements make it clear that digital IDs and CBDCs are meant to function together. Without a digital ID, the CBDC financial system wouldn't be viable, mainly due to the Know Your Customer (KYC) functionality built into the digital finance framework. For KYC requirements, they need to know who you are, so they're designing wallets tied to digital IDs, and these digital IDs would be linked to your physical identity through biometric data. There are several initiatives to make digital IDs a reality. Some involve creating these IDs as non-fungible tokens, NFTs, while others are driven by projects like WorldCoin, a venture from Sam Altman of OpenAI. With WorldCoin, users scan their iris, providing a biometric identifier tied to a unique digital ID and wallet. The UN has already implemented a similar system for refugee aid in its World Food Program. This system, called Building Blocks, uses blockchain technology. Refugees in camps scan their irises at store-style locations to get food. The cost of their groceries is deducted from a digital wallet connected to their digital ID and iris scan. This type of system, once tested in refugee camps, may one day be widely deployed across nations, regardless of region or economic alignment.
I think it's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC or this type of digital currency system is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event. I think the immigration crises, any sort of refugee situation, that's going to be used to push for digital IDs. I think it's just a very easy excuse for them, a way for them to quickly manufacture consent. Because, all these people, we don't know who they are. They could be criminals, they could be anybody. We have to know who everybody is. And it's going to be sold as a way to provide security to the insecurity created by the migrant crisis. So I think there's been growing awareness for some time that there's a lot of bipartisan consensus about most of the policies of the US government, like endless war, for example. And some people refer to it as the uniparty. But people also forget that too. And so what a lot of people call this the two-party model, people refer to it sometimes as the left-right paradigm. But I think not a lot of people truly understand how that paradigm works. If you think about it as the left hand and right hand of the establishment, you'll have one of those hands create a problem intentionally, and then the opposing hand comes in and offers the solution.
So who's behind this global push for digital IDs? Much of it is tied to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, particularly Goal 16.9, which calls for universal legal identity from birth as part of a broader agenda for peace and inclusivity. To achieve this, the UN initiated the ID 2020 Alliance, now part of the Digital Impact Alliance, which shares similar funders and goals. The primary argument these organizations put forth is the need to close the identity gap. The claim that billions worldwide, especially those in poorer regions, lack access to essential services like banking, healthcare, and education due to a lack of verifiable identity. To fix this, they propose onboarding these populations onto digital identity systems. Even though digital IDs are being promoted as essential, there's a natural skepticism about this vision. After looking deeper into WF materials, it's clear that this digital integration is a major goal within their framework for the fourth industrial revolution. One article they published discusses accelerating digital inclusion for 1 billion people by 2025. This initiative is marketed as positive and inclusive, aiming to bring people online for health, education, and financial services. But what's happening behind the scenes? Critics like Webb argue that these digital IDs are being piloted in underdeveloped regions as a testbed to refine the system before it's expanded on a larger scale, potentially enabling governments or corporations to control individuals' access to basic services. This isn't a far-fetched idea, as similar systems are already in place in countries like China. Chinese authorities use AI and facial recognition software to monitor citizens, automatically affecting their social credit scores for actions like jaywalking. A low social credit score can restrict access to services, including entry into certain stores. This kind of surveillance shows what's possible with integrated digital IDs and leaves some wondering if similar systems could one day appear in other countries. The push for digital ID systems is gaining traction worldwide, with countries already implementing them, proving it's not just a hypothetical concept. If anyone thinks this can't reach the US, they might be underestimating the situation, but to oppose it, it's essential to understand how these systems work. Whitney Webb dives into the deeper mechanisms of these ID programs, particularly how they're designed to fill what's termed the identity gap.
The man that claims to have created CBDCs is a man from Barbados named Oliver Gale. He created one of the first, well, arguably the first CBDC project in the Caribbean, and then went on to have a key role in creating the Nigerian CBDC, the e-Naira. So the way the CBDC in Nigeria was set up is that in order to access the CBDC, you have to have a national identification number, which is the Nigerian digital ID project. So you have to have a digital ID in order to be able to access the Nigerian CBDC. And the way they tried to get people to onboard to the CBD system was by essentially cutting off the vast majority of the cash in circulation in Nigeria. And so despite the fact that they created these conditions to coerce people into using the CBDC, the populace resists. And that suggests that the idea of CBDCs being a tool for financial inclusion, the public doesn't seem to believe that, right? In Nigeria, these people that ostensibly suffer from this identity gap, that suffer from financial exclusion, don't want the financial inclusion that they're being offered by the CBDC. They don't see any real benefit. They see it as a tool of the state. And the state in Nigeria and in other African countries where these sort of systems are being rolled out, the governments have abused these systems to go after journalists or other people and violate human rights and all sorts of things.
According to advocates, people without recognized IDs, many of them in economically challenged regions, struggle to access essential services like healthcare, banking, and government assistance. This argument forms the core of the push for inclusion through digital IDs. The marketing emphasizes equity and inclusion, suggesting that these systems are about giving everyone equal access to resources. However, as Webb points out, these systems can actually exclude people, setting barriers if someone isn't enrolled in the digital ID network. Without a digital ID, individuals may lose access to services they previously relied on, essentially framing this inclusion in a way that also controls access. The UN, for example, frequently refers to digital ID initiatives as a pathway to human rights, though some internal documents use human rights more as policy tools rather than inalienable rights. This shift implies that rights could be regulated, controlled, or even removed within this digital framework, undermining the concept of rights as universal. Further linking digital ID to financial systems, there are documents where the UN, IMF, and other organizations outline a merging of digital ID with central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. For instance, a UN paper titled "The People's Money" highlights a citizen-centric digital finance system that's meant to be integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. According to this document, individuals' savings and income could be accessed to fund projects aligned with the SDGs, effectively placing your assets within a framework that someone else can control. The rhetoric surrounding these documents, Webb argues, is full of urgency, promising people that this system will return finance to serving the public. But the document suggests something deeper, that more power could concentrate into the hands of a few major players like BlackRock, which regularly participates in these discussions. It's worth questioning whether a firm like BlackRock would suddenly prioritize the public good over its own interests. Whitney Webb thinks it's all manufactured.
This company called Cybereason in 2020 actually simulated a massive killware attack that was targeting a US presidential election. And the way they conducted this killware simulation, which they did with DHS and some US law enforcement agencies, was to get the US presidential election canceled and martial law declared. So they basically, through that simulation, established what types of hacks could succeed in achieving the declaration of martial law and the cancellation of a U.S. presidential election, which is pretty extreme.
So
why are they doing that?
Why?
I don't know. Why does an intelligence-linked company want to simulate with DHS and law enforcement a series of hacks that disrupt national infrastructure during a U.S. presidential election and martial law is declared? Well, if you look at all of this through the lens of risk management, from the elite's perspective, let's take the words of Larry Fink, for example, of BlackRock, who's been obsessed with risk management his whole career. He has a quote, he's on video saying that the markets do not like democracy. Democracy is messy. They like totalitarian governments because the risk is low. Elon Musk is one of these figures that's trying to sort of position himself as a free speech champion and one of these figures that's on the populist right. But in reality, a lot of the policies that Elon Musk promotes, like carbon taxes, for example, have traditionally been policies promoted like the World Economic Forum and entities like this that are seen as being globalist and not populist in nature.
During the pandemic, vaccine passports became a testing ground for these systems. Entities promoting digital ID, such as ID 2020, were also involved in pushing for these passports, tying access to public spaces to one's health status. This raised concerns about how digital ID systems could restrict people's movement and access, especially if tied to stipulations like health records or compliance with certain policies. And it doesn't end at ID access alone. These digital ID initiatives are set to be vast. Groups like ID 2020 propose vendor-agnostic systems, which means private companies could each create their own digital IDs, all feeding into a central global database managed by the World Bank under the ID4D project. This setup could mean that, while appearing decentralized, the system actually consolidates data under global institutions with significant influence like the IMF and World Bank. The UN's approach aligns national governments to serve as enforcers of these policies rather than independent policymakers. Countries, especially those in financial debt to global institutions, often face pressure to adopt such digital ID systems to receive funding. This model of financial encouragement means that national governments may adopt digital ID frameworks as a condition for aid, subtly creating what Webb terms a form of debt slavery that enforces these policies globally. Historically, the UN was a public sector body, but according to former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, the 1990s brought a quiet revolution. The UN's role shifted from a public forum to a public-private partnership model, essentially merging business interests with governance. This system prioritizes the interests of powerful corporations over democratic choice, reflecting what Webb calls crony capitalism rather than free market practices. The shift has centralized control, allowing a select group of private entities to operate with more power than many national governments.
You know, like Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg, Bill Gates, all of these guys are the ones influencing these policies more than anyone. They admit that they're exacerbating the wealth gap, but we're full steam ahead on these policies anyway. So, I mean, they're obviously going to keep exacerbating it. And a lot of those guys that are designing and maintaining the technology or deciding what it does are going to be in a very different class than the rest of us who are, you know, having this system imposed upon us. We're not the ones designing it. We don't have a stake in the stakeholder capitalism model. You know, we're the policy subjects, not the policy makers. We don't have any. We don't have any influence on these policies. The people that do have that influence are oligarchs and bankers and, the elite, essentially. They want to give the illusion that it's a decentralized system, that you're in control of your data, that you have power. But, if you look at how the infrastructure is set up, those are really just marketing. It's marketing, it's talking points. It's not how these things actually are when they're implemented in practice. And the way they're creating the infrastructure is to create centralized data depositories, centralized policy-making bodies, things like that. But they want to give the public the illusion that they're being implemented in essentially the complete opposite way.
Whitney Webb really stresses this. Despite the promises of equity and inclusion, the underlying framework of these digital ID systems is less about rights and more about regulation and control. It's a system that, on the surface, offers participation, but in reality, consolidates power, leaving questions about who truly benefits from this global restructuring. So here's where things stand. Samuel Pisar, a notable figure and stepfather to current U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, once testified before Congress about the emergence of what he called trans-ideological corporations. Essentially, he pointed out that some Western capitalists had teamed up with leaders from state-owned enterprises in the communist bloc to create powerful corporate alliances, which would eventually become so influential that they could render nation-states almost irrelevant. Sound familiar? This is essentially the blueprint we're seeing today, with policies like CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and digital IDs all part of the playbook. Many of these policies are being folded into the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda, or the Digital ID Initiative, and different think tanks and organizations are pushing them hard. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, have nearly every country on board, even those that supposedly don't align with Western ideals. Countries like Russia and China, for example, have expressed support for Agenda 2030. At the same time, the US and the European Union are also on board. It's a global consensus that these policies should be enforced worldwide, regardless of political divides. There's also growing skepticism about the UN's role as a global superpower, but here's the kicker. The same powers that propelled the US to global dominance post-World War II are now behind this new so-called multipolar world order we're seeing take shape today, thanks to some of the biggest names in the world.
Well, I think there's a conflict of interest with Elon Musk. So, for example, take his recent ownership of Twitter, now called X. The Pentagon has spent the better part of the last decade developing very sophisticated tools to manipulate social media, including bots and other techniques that, per the Air Force in one of their contracts, said was aimed at controlling people with social media like we control drones. Do you think that Elon Musk, as a Pentagon and intelligence contractor, would restrict the Pentagon's use of those tools they spent millions of dollars in over a decade developing? I don't think so. I think we're being pushed towards essentially the same policies, but by a different group of quote-unquote leaders who are trying to frame themselves as the opposite side of the political divide because the existing side that was pushing those was, they were using sort of more like left-leaning political rhetoric. And so because they got pushback, they're trying to sell those same policies in a different wrapper that's sort of cloaked in this rhetoric of populism and right-leaning politics. I think there's essentially a consensus that some other very significant financial crisis is in the cards for the next several years. And if you are the big banks and you know that's going to happen, you probably want to avoid a scenario like what happened in 2008, where the public knew that you were the source of the malfeasance and the economic problems.
Right after World War II, Bretton Woods set up U.S. financial dominance across the globe. Now we're hearing talk of a new Bretton Woods moment, where under the guise of creating a fair, multipolar world, a new system of global financial governance is being introduced. The unsettling part? The whole thing is being sold to us as decentralized, when in reality it couldn't be more centralized. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and digital IDs are just more ways for the UN, IMF, and World Economic Forum to keep the reins tight. And what's shocking is how few people know this is even happening. Right now, probably 99% of the world's population has no idea about these agendas or the power plays in motion. That's why it's critical to spread awareness about what's really going on. That'll do it for this video, folks. Thanks for watching.